I wrote a book called The Next Convergence because I was told I had to write a book that had a story in it by my agent. And the story that I was trying to tell is that we're in the middle of a century in which the 85% of the people on the planet who really weren't part of the Industrial Revolution and its aftermath that started in 1750 are in the process of sort of catching up. And so this was very hard to see. It started after World War II. It started when the global economy, was put together by policy and technology, and when the colonial empires fell apart. And so now we can see a pretty clear pattern that was very difficult to see at the time, which is that the developing countries are on a path, very high growth path, the end of which will be, per capita incomes like what we associate with the OECD countries. That's the club of countries that have incomes at or above $20,000 a person. Now this is an enormous change in the global economy. I mean, if even 75% of that 85% ends up in this category, then we're talking about a world in which the majority of people live like us. And what I was trying to write about is how this high growth works, why it's happening. These are growth rates we've never seen before, 7, 8, 9, 10%. And I was also trying to write about what the challenges are for completing the remaining 40 to 50 years of this century of convergence. Will our natural resources stand up? Can we run this global economy with all these players with diverse backgrounds and interests and so on? So that's what convergence means. It means catching up with the advanced countries. I'd spend the second half of the book trying to address these questions. What are these challenges? Can we meet them? And so on. And they come in different categories, but I guess my conclusion is the following. We're at a kind of crossroads in the global economy. The developing countries as a group are in the process of passing the 50% mark as a fraction of the global economy. In the next 25 or 30 years, the global economy will triple in size if nothing bad happens, if nothing goes wrong. Most of that growth will occur in Asia because the countries in Asia are growing at high rates for the most part, including the two future economic giants, China in the lead, and then somewhere around 13 or 14 years behind at high growth rates, India. That's for almost 40% of the world's population. And so the challenges come in the form, can we manage the transitions? And that's a complicated set of questions. What you're seeing now in China, for example, is a growing awareness that the growth model, pattern, whatever you call it, I think Chinese people tend to call it a growth pattern, that the one that we've used in the past, all of the predecessors in the developing world and the so-called advanced countries, probably just doesn't scale up, and we're going to have to invent a new one. So the straight answer to the question, are we going to be able to solve these problems, is we don't know. And then there's the question of the environment and natural resources. I mean, lots of people are asking themselves the question, can we run the global economy at the current scale with the natural resource base that we have been given? If that's an interesting or serious question, and I think it is, then you have to amplify it manyfold if you're going to triple the size of the global economy. A lot of it, I think, depends on setting off on the right path. And you can talk yourself into being optimistic or pessimistic depending on what you're looking at. We're not making much progress on global, environmental things like climate change right now. On the other hand, there's some movement in that direction. And a China that views natural resources as a potential constraint on its objective of achieving, the end of its growth path, advanced country income levels and opportunities, is a China that's going to move aggressively to try to remove the obstacles by changing the growth pattern, changing what in China is called lifestyles. In China, it means how cities are built, what the transportation systems look like, how fast the population is going to grow, how many children you're going to have, what kind of vehicles are we going to drive, a whole lot of things that will be conditioned and constrained in order to make the thing scale up. And And I guess if you asked me, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic that human ingenuity confronted with necessity will probably make a pretty big dent in these problems. Does the current global mess, the crisis, its aftermath, now the chaos, not chaos, but instability in Europe, is this going to derail the whole thing? I think the answer to that is probably no. Let me outline roughly the reasons why I think that. But it's not a sure thing. First of all, really for the first time in the post-crisis period, the emerging economies with the big ones, well managed in the lead, were able to restore their growth rates and sustain them even when the advanced countries were growing at very, very low rates or even not at all. Now that's new. I mean, I think most people would agree if you go back 10 or 15 years with a smaller group of countries, with China and India at much earlier stages, with much lower levels of income. If you asked, if you slow down America and Europe, can you sustain the growth in the advanced countries? I think the answer was no. They're too reliant on the demand, the consumption from those countries and its growth. Now they can generate enough of their own demand, even if we sort of go flat, is the way to think about it. However, I don't think they can keep it up at the same level if we turn down. So one fairly big risk, and it's a perceived risk here in Asia and in China specifically, is that if we have a major problem in Europe, a real problem that turns that economy down, that will take the American economy down. Because they're very closely linked in terms of trade and financial connections. And if you take down the majority, Japan's also struggling for different reasons. If you take down pretty much all of the advanced countries, then I think you'll put a big enough dent in global aggregate demand that it will actually slow down the emerging economies. I don't think it'll derail them, but it will slow them down. A lot of it, I think, depends on setting off on the right path. And you can talk yourself into being optimistic or pessimistic depending on what you're looking at. We're not making much progress on global, environmental things like climate change right now. On the other hand, there's some movement in that direction. And a China that views natural resources as a potential constraint on its objective of achieving, the end of its growth path, advanced country income levels and opportunities, is a China that's going to move aggressively to try to remove the obstacles by changing the growth pattern, changing what in China is called lifestyles. In China, it means how cities are built, what the transportation systems look like, how fast the population is going to grow, how many children you're going to have, what kind of vehicles are we going to drive, a whole lot of things that will be conditioned and constrained in order to make the thing scale up. And I guess if you asked me, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic that human ingenuity confronted with necessity will probably make a pretty big dent in these problems. What I am interested in now is closer to what I was interested in as a human being as opposed to an economist when I was younger. When I was younger, I was an applied microtheorist. I was fascinated by market structure and how markets actually worked and when they didn't work and why. And I guess that was kind of useful work. But what I like now about having a focus on understanding both the successes and failures and the challenges of emerging economy growth, developing country growth, is that it's set in a context in which something truly extraordinary is happening, which is hundreds of millions of people's lives are getting better. Not steadily, not uniformly, not without hiccups, but when you stand back and look at the direction of movement and the number of people whose children and grandchildren are going to have real opportunities to be productive, to be creative, not to have to worry about whether they're going to be able to eat the next day and so on. I mean, it's extraordinary. So in some sense for me, what I kind of am very interested in, it has its sort of technical and complexity, so it's engaging, but it's also a sort of marvelous thing in human terms to watch and occasionally be part of.